So we're up to Chapter 15, Presentation and Analysis of Stockholders' Equity. And I'll do separate videos on sort of the presentation of the stockholders' equity section of the balance sheet and the actual statement of stockholders' equity. So on this one, I'm going to focus on just the analysis part and then move on to those. Okay, so when you're analyzing stockholders' equity, you've got the return on stockholders' equity, which is your net income minus your preferred dividends, divided by your average common stockholders' equity. So this may be somewhat of a review from AC 102, but sometimes it's helpful to go over that. First of all, if there's no preferred dividends in the problem, you just have net income, okay? You don't take off the common dividends, just the preferred dividends. Average stockholders' equity is made up of common stock and retained earnings together. So when you're given the information for the problem, you have to add common stock and retained earnings for the beginning. So you would get the 300,000, right? You'd have to add your common stock and retained earnings for the, I'm sorry, this is the ending, this is the beginning. For the beginning, the 2019 here, and you would get 180,000. That's not right. What'd you get to? Oh no, let me see if I can get my numbers right here. You would get 250. So this is the total 102, that gives you the 300,000 here, the 250, that's your beginning ending. You add them up, and you would get your 550, divide it by 2 to get the average, and so you end up with average common stockholders' equity of 275. So you have to total up, these two here and these two here, beginning, ending, and divide by 2. So if we're doing this problem, you would end up with, we've got the net income is 60,000 divided by our average stockholders' equity of 275. It gives you a return on common stockholders' equity of 0.22. Okay, so then you have to ask yourself, is that good or bad? What is the meaning of that? And when you're looking at that, you have to say, well, is that okay, or change what I'm looking at here. Is that okay or not okay? So one easy way to think about it is just change it up a little bit and say you're going to keep the same average stockholders' equity, but instead of, say, 60,000 here, say we generated 90,000 in net income. Okay, so when you divide that out, you would get 0.33. Okay, and then you could try it out and say, oh, okay, so what if we only did 30,000 in net income? This is just one way to get familiar with what these ratios are trying to communicate to you. And so this would be 11. All right, so, and what does all that mean? Well, if you've got the same amount of investment, okay, you've got the same amount of investment in all three cases, but for the net income generated for the stockholders here is 60,000. Here you're generating more net income, and so you have a higher return on stockholders' equity. Here you're generating less income, so you have a lower return on stockholders' equity. So doing sort of the three scenarios can help you to sort of understand and have these actually mean something to you rather than just say, oh yeah, I'll memorize that ratio, because these actually are useful. Okay, so that would be the return on stockholders' equity. The next one the book talks about is the payout ratio. And this relates cash dividends to net income. In other words, what's the ratio of the cash dividends we're paying out to our happy stockholders to the net income we're generating? So if you're paying out 15,000 in dividends and 60,000 is the net income, well, you've got a payout ratio of 0.25. And sort of working it the same way we did above here, well, what if your dividends were only 5,000 and your net income was still 60,000? So you've got a much lower payout ratio. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Not necessarily, because it could mean that the company is putting its resources back into the company, maybe buying more assets, maybe doing more research and development, doing other things with the money than paying it out as dividends to the stockholders. Okay, so then you could take the other scenario where we're paying out 80,000 in dividends and we're only making 60,000 in net income. Here you've got a really nice high payout ratio, but one might question, is that sustainable? You know, I might tend to want to sell the stock in that company. But anyway, so this is just relating your cash dividends to net income. You have to be careful when you're actually using this ratio because it'll vary by industry. There are some industries that, because of the environment they operate in, usually like the larger utilities, that they can sort of have a consistent, reasonable dividend that they pay year after year after year. So they'd have a fairly constant payout ratio. If you've got companies that are in cyclical industries where, you know, it goes up and down in a big cycle, they probably can't maintain a consistent dividend over time, but that doesn't mean there aren't other reasons that they might be a good company. So this is just one of the things that you can look at. Book value per share. So we're trying to figure out we're looking at the net assets of the company. Remember, your assets minus your liabilities gives you your stockholders' equity. Another word for that is the net assets. So this is going to be your common stockholders' equity. Okay, and again, you got to remember that common stockholders' equity is the total of common stock and retained earnings divided by the outstanding shares. Okay, so say we've got stockholders' equity that's pretty constant at 300,000, okay, and the outstanding shares are 1 million. So that would give us a book value per share of 30 cents, okay? Then just to contrast that, if you had the same stockholders' equity, but you only had 500,000 shares outstanding, then your book value per share would be 60 cents. Okay. Fairly straightforward. Book value, you can compare the book value per share to the market value per share, and all else equal, if the market value per share is more, it may be a sign that, you know, let me start that part over. If the book value is more than the market value, then the stock might be undervalued, and it might be a good time to pick some up. You have to consider a lot of other items there too. These are referring only to common shares. If there's preferred stock involved, the computations are a little more complicated, and we can save that for when you transfer to a 4-year school. Okay, and then the other thing with book value per share that we can address at this point is, if you think of a balance sheet, if you've got companies that have a lot of intangible assets, and many of the large corporations have a lot of intangible assets, if they were internally generated, you remember that if they're all internally generated, the R&D and everything that goes into them, except for the registering of the patents and so forth, has to be expensed. And so that will not show up as assets on the balance sheet. So if you have one company that has a lot of internally generated assets, intangible assets, versus a company that purchased all their intangibles, those purchased intangibles will show up on the balance sheet. And so you could not compare the book value. That would influence the book value of both of those companies. So you have to look further than just, the results you get from any of these ratios. All right, so those are the 3 things I talk about with analyzing stockholders' equity section, and so now we'll take a look at the stockholders' equity section and, the statement of stockholders' equity.